About 3 years ago now, I made a video in which I predicted the eventual rise on the distant right of a kind of right wing postmodernism. And although in that video I was not able specifically to foresee the emergence of the neo-absolutists or post-liberals on YouTube, those groups very much do fit within the broad train or strain of what I was attempting then to describe. And so once they became a thing, once they rose up on YouTube, I began watching them with some interest and with a great deal of amusement. Now, I suppose as of right now, probably the most prominent of these these thinkers, these YouTube commentators, would probably be Keith Woods. And something very interesting has happened with Keith Woods. Specifically, what I'm talking about is the recent video that he made in which he deplored the post truth condition that we seem to find ourselves in today in the modern West. Now, he sort of used the coronavirus issue as a framing device, but essentially he said that he would hear all sorts of people online talking about the coronavirus, putting forth all sorts of conspiracy theories, namely that it's a bioweapon or something of that sort. And when he would try to push back against these people and try to interrogate them and make them provide evidence for their claims, they were not able to do so to his satisfaction. And although he made counterclaims against them, Keith Woods again complains that they didn't respond to him sufficiently well, and yet, despite all this, held on to their views. So Keith Woods observes this and says that truth seems to be becoming political, that it's being used as a political weapon, and he deplores this. Now, the reason why I say that this is interesting and was really unexpected for me is that it completely contradicts the general orientation of the neo-absolutists or post-liberals when it comes to politics. The neo-absolutists slash post-liberals, and I include Keith Woods among them, generally have the following sort of critique about liberal social contract theory. And although the critique is focused specifically on liberal social contract theory, the fact that this approach to government and its justification is really the only serious game in town in the West today really makes it into a broader critique of modern political philosophy more generally. And the criticism runs something like this. The social contract thought experiment devised by and appealed to by philosophers like Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, etc., essentially has it that there existed a kind of a pre-social state, as they put it, a pre-social situation in which an aggregation of rationally self-interested individuals, for the sake of preserving the vast bulk of their natural rights, for the sake of preserving the vast majority of their interests, come together in a rational negotiation and agree to forego some of these interests and then set up a state. So they sacrifice a small part of their rights, a small part of their interests for the sake of creating a state. And then that state secures the remainder of them from attack, from any kind of disruption, because the situation in the state of nature, as it's posited in this thought experiment, is very precarious. And so the rights of individuals are similarly precarious. So in other words, this is just a self-interested kind of negotiation, and it results in the state. And the state, insofar as it functions to preserve the rights for which this thought experiment has it that the state was originally created, well, insofar as the state does that, it's a legitimate institution, it's justified, etc. Now, the neo-absolutists or post-liberal critique of this runs roughly as follows. It says that the state, which is supposed to be the sovereign entity in society, is, by the way in which things are framed within this thought experiment, actually subordinated to a kind of rational structure, that there is a kind of reason, quote unquote, reason so called, as they might have it, to which the state is subjected. So the state isn't ultimately sovereign, as it should be, Rather, the state is subjected to liberal reason as a kind of super sovereignty. And because the liberal conception of reason is this super sovereignty over the state, that then empowers a class of reason interpreters, intellectuals, journalists, media figures, etc., to essentially dictate what it is that reason, so called, requires. This then gives this class tremendous power, and it makes them the sovereigns rather than what the true sovereign should be, which is whoever it is that's in charge of the state. Sovereignty moves, that is, ultimate sovereignty moves from the state to them, and then it allows this class to essentially foist an ideology onto society, namely the sort of liberal modern ideology that we've seen take over the West. And then that has had all sorts of baleful social consequences: deterioration of relationship between the sexes, deterioration of national homogeneity and solidarity among European nations, etc., etc. I won't run through the whole gamut. I assume that those watching this are familiar with the kinds of problems that I have in mind here. So the critique basically is this. The way that the neo-absolutists and post-liberals frame it, power simply exists. It simply is. The king simply owns his subjects, and he has power over them by virtue of the fact that he is able to exercise that power. Because he is powerful enough, this is sort of redundantly phrased, but because he wields the might necessary to exercise power, he for that very reason alone has the right to wield power. The king, in this formulation, owns his subjects, and power is simply a fact of life. Power simply is, and it is not in need of any further justification beyond itself. And the allegation here is that liberalism, in subjecting power to the need of some sort of justification, in saying that power has to justify itself, it has created problems. Now, there's an obvious issue with this critique, which is that it's not really an argument. And what I mean by that is that if you take its premises seriously, then you have to ultimately forego the very possibility of rational discourse itself. Because remember, under this framing, power simply exists, and it is a law unto itself. It does not require any further justification. Why am I entitled to rule you? Because I'm bigger than you and I can club you over the head. And that's it. And if I'm able to do that, then I don't have to explain myself to you. I don't have to say that, well, actually, my ruling over you is ultimately good for you. The fact that this condition prevails actually aims at some good, and it is possible through reason to explain what this good is, to enunciate it, to communicate it, and then ultimately to make those over whom power is exercised understand it so that they accept their condition and come to realize that the power relation between themselves and the sovereign ultimately redounds to their good. It's not necessary to do that under the neo-absolutist framing because power is ultimate, power is primary, power simply is. So I listened to this, and as I said, it's sort of the perfect culmination of postmodernism itself. It is as power-centric as anything that Michel Foucault may have said. In fact, as I sat around thinking about this, it occurred to me that near the end of his life, Michel Foucault was actually starting to investigate libertarian ideas. He was actually looking into and expressing interest in the ideas of Hayek and Mises. And as unexpected as that may sound, it's true, and it made me wonder, given how many former libertarians eventually wound up turning to these kind of dissonant right, white nationalist, white identitarian, neo-absolutist, neo-reactionary, etc. sort of camps, it made me wonder if Foucault hadn't gone ahead and purposefully gotten himself infected with AIDS and gotten himself killed, would he have ended up a neo-absolutist? I mean, it certainly would have fit within the frame of his general philosophy, given the centrality of power within it. But now, all of this, as I've pointed out, this is not really amenable to rational discussion because it doesn't hold the possibility of a rational mediation between disputes to even really be possible. All that is primary is power. And if power is primary, then it follows that power is ultimately the only thing that exists. And so the only standard upon which you can be judged is whether or not what you choose to do ultimately enables you to attain power. There is no other standard beyond this. Now, so the problems with the neo-absolutist framing, I think, are just too obvious to even require discussion. But why I say that these things are interesting is, as I mentioned, Keith Woods went on to make a video in which he deplores the post-truth condition that modernity seems to be entering, that there are these opposed political factions who've dug their heels in against one another and who are not willing to listen to any contrary facts or arguments to their point of view, and they will take and twist anything they can in the service of their ideology so that they can maintain their beliefs. And it doesn't matter what you say to them, it doesn't matter how you argue to them, they will continue to dig their heels in, and so truth becomes a political weapon. Truth becomes politicized. Well, here's the odd thing about this complaint. Given what a post-liberal or a neo-absolutist believes, given what someone like Keith Woods believes about politics, I don't see what possible grounds he has to complain about this. I mean, if power is really primary, then what exactly is wrong with using truth as a political cudgel? That is entirely permissible under that framing. It is absolutely allowed to twist facts or to formulate narratives and to promulgate quote-unquote truth in such a way that it might help you to overcome your enemies. I mean, whatever works, right? Whatever enables you to destroy your enemies and attain power is all that is. The only thing, again, that exists under this framing is power, because power is primary and it is not required to submit to any rational order standing above it. So it's very odd to me that Keith Woods would complain about this. Now, I don't expect him to watch this video or anything like that, but I can already predict how a response that he would make might go. He might say something like this: well, what do you mean I think that power is ultimate and primary and a law unto itself and requires no justification? That's nonsense. He might then point to the video that he made about Bronze Age pervert and the Bronze Age mindset. And that in that video he specifically criticized this kind of nihilistic, power-based Nietzschean perspective that Bronze Age pervert took up. And he said things in the video like, well, Bronze Age pervert may have said that he doesn't intend to give any arguments in his book, but it's nevertheless obvious that the fact that he wrote the book that he wrote and that he has large numbers of people agreeing with him indicates already that those people are motivated by a certain kind of moral vision, by a certain kind of moral pathos, and it must at least be possible in principle to integrate whatever that moral vision is into some sort of rational structure. So they are implicitly being motivated by some transcendental ethical end that they're aiming at, and that can be enunciated in a philosophical system. So it's just nonsense that he's basing everything in this kind of nihilistic power-based way. And he ultimately even says that if you take seriously the idea that power is ultimate, then all you will ultimately be left with is a congeries of competing groups with opposing interests fighting each other, and then whoever wins, wins, and that's the end of it. Well, it is true that he did say this in that video. He may have said all of those things. He may have criticized Bronze Age pervert for all of those things. But it nevertheless is the case anyway that those criticisms are incompatible with his own criticism of liberal social contract theory. You cannot simultaneously reject the power-based Nietzschean approach of someone like Bronze Age pervert, in which power is everything, and then also claim that in politics, in the realm of politics, power is primary. Um, these things are just incompatible. Now, it may be, now perhaps Keith Woods might say, well, all right, fine, perhaps it is true that power does owe an account of itself to some sort of higher rational law, to some sort of higher rationality into which it must integrate itself. But it doesn't follow that whatever end it is that power must justify itself by aiming at would have to be the end of preserving or promoting the self-interest of a group of rational individuals who come together in society. Well, all right, fair enough. It might theoretically be possible to justify the state with respect to some other end than the promotion of individual rational self-interest. But even so, even if you say that, you will nevertheless already have accepted the framing that power is not automatic, that it's not a law unto itself, that the king does not simply own his subjects in the sense that he may do whatever he pleases with them, whether what he does to them and for them is ultimately good for them or not. So power on this framing, even if it's being justified with respect to some other end, is still being justified with respect to some end. And therefore, there is this kind of, as the neo-absolutists would put it, super sovereignty of reason operating here. And I mean, those are ultimately the only alternatives. I mean, in the end, whatever you might say, either the state, if it is to be justified, must be justified with respect to some end, or you simply have the reign of raw, untrammeled power. And there is no arguing with power. There is no need for rational discourse in the true sense. I mean, you can have a kind of mock rational discourse, but then rational discourse isn't really rational discourse in the sense that it attempts to arrive at some truth. It's just a means by which to manipulate or cajole your opponents. It's just one more tactic for the exertion of power. So that's not really rational discourse. It's just a mockery of it. And yeah, under that framing where power is all there is, that's all you can have. So it's pretty clear to me that Keith Woods is contradicting himself by saying on the one hand that power is primary, and on the other hand that it's bad, that truth becomes a political weapon. Well, why? Why is it bad? I mean, and you can run down the list of other things that Keith Woods has said in this regard, and sort of tease out the contradictions and the problems a bit more. For instance, in his discussion with the academic agent about property rights, his criticism of libertarian property rights theory ultimately comes down to his saying that these property rights are arbitrary. Academic agent gave an argument for libertarian property rights to the effect that without some clear system of consistent rules which specifies who is right and who is wrong in all cases of conflict, and who exactly owns what scarce resource, then in a world of scarcity, conflict will be inevitable, and without a means to resolve the conflicts that will emerge, which is what a system of property rights ultimately is, you will not really be able to have social order in any proper sense of the term. And it would also follow that because property rights are precarious, that is, that you won't really have the backing of a legal system behind you should they come under threat. And since there's this constant war of all against all going on, you will not be incentivized to engage in any long-term production plans simply because your property rights won't be secure. Without this work in long-term production, there will be no development of the capital structure, and society will be exceptionally poor. Now, Keith Woods said, all right, fine, let's admit that all of this is true. Nevertheless, this is a purely instrumental argument. It's a utilitarian argument. And so therefore, libertarian property rights are ultimately arbitrary because, well, who says poverty is bad? One can imagine an ethical system in which this isn't a bad thing. And the same could be said for social order or any other kind of hypothetical imperative, to use the Kantian terminology. Well, here's the problem. With this, Keith Woods is an Irish nationalist. He obviously wants Ireland to flourish and for the Irish people to do well. But if he really takes seriously the idea that power is primary, what exactly would be wrong with the fact that, well, let's say hypothetically, a billion Africans were to flood into Ireland, slaughter every Irish man, rape every Irish woman, destroy Ireland entirely, and just subjugate it completely? If Keith Woods takes seriously the idea that power is primary, is a law unto itself, and is subject to no further justification beyond itself, what would be wrong with this? I mean, the only sense in which it could be shown wrong is if the attempt by the billion Africans to do this were somehow beaten back by the Irish. But suppose that the Africans weren't beaten back. Suppose that they did manage to successfully destroy and subjugate Ireland in this way. What would be wrong with it? You would have one group and then another group, and they would each have their competing interests, and they would struggle for power, and one of them would win. And since power ultimately power just exists and is subject to no law beyond it which should constrain it, that's really all you can say on the matter. So, if Keith Woods believes this, in what sense can he really be a nationalist, other than simply to say, well, I too belong to a group, namely the Irish, and the Irish have their own interests, and I am competing in the arena just like everyone else is. And there's no inherent right or wrong, it's just whoever wins. I'll say the same thing to Keith Woods if he chooses to make such a response that he said about Bronze Age pervert. I just don't believe that that's what you're really thinking, if you should choose to respond that way. I just don't buy it. I mean, if you take seriously the idea, once again, that power is primary and is subject to no constraints beyond itself, well, then I would have to ask someone like Keith Woods, in all sincerity, this is not a facetious question. I don't ask this ironically. Why aren't you a globalist? Because it's not the nationalists who are in power. It's the globalists who control every institution. It's them who dominate everything in the West. That's where power resides. And if they are in power, and power is primary and power is ultimate, then what objection can be made to anything that they're doing? And again, by objection, I mean a serious objection, a sincere objection, not an objection simply made as a technique or a tactic to turn the tables and win power, but a real ultimate moral objection that aims at, sort of moral truth and moral reality and so forth. And in what sense can you make an objection to anything that the globalists are doing from that perspective? Very clearly you can't. So I have to say this whole thing of neo-absolutism and of post-liberalism, it's not a serious alternative to the liberal order. It's just not, because all it is a contest of wills, and whoever wins wins. There is no rational coherence to that. There is no structure to it. And the only thing I can say about it is that it seems quite evidently to be born out of desperation. Those on the right look around and say, the left has power over everything. They're disaffected, they're alienated, they're desperate, they're in despair, and they just say, to hell with it. Let's go for this set of ideas because it is about power. And after all, we are in this desperate situation. We are in these dire straits where the West's very demographic integrity threatens to be eroded, and so we need to grab power back from these people by any means necessary. But of course, it's a long way from being a YouTube commentator to actually having political power. So, I mean, as I say, again, there is no... This is not a serious alternative to anything proposed by liberalism because it's not constrained by any aim at ends. Power is its own end, and that's all there is. Now, lest anyone like Keith Woods or anyone who agrees with him might feel tempted to respond, well, but you have to question liberal social contract theory because it's the foundation of the liberal approach to all socio-political issues, and therefore by extension the foundation of the modern approach to all socio-political issues. And so unless you strike at the root, how can you really do anything to help lift the West out of its current malaise, out of the current situation that we happen to be in modernity. Now, as I sat around thinking about what I'd say for this video, Keith Woods cranked out another video, a short video, in which he examined very briefly the origins of liberalism, specifically the social contract idea. And I'm actually glad that he made this video, because he claimed that Thomas Hobbes was the originator of liberal political philosophy. And he completely ignores what you might call the prehistory of liberalism. Now, to be fair to Keith Woods here, I understand that if you're going to trace out the history of any concept, you necessarily have to start somewhere, and so it will unavoidably be the case that whatever beginning point you choose will be to some extent arbitrary. I understand that. However, in this particular case, I think it is instructive to go much further back than Hobbes, because if we do go further back than Hobbes, we will see something about liberalism that, I think is very important and interesting. And if you just choose to arbitrarily start at Hobbes, you will miss virtually everything about the liberal idea that is so interesting and that ultimately makes it such a conundrum for us today. Because Keith Woods in this video essentially framed things such that that modern philosophers like Hobbes apparently just woke up one day and decided to frame all socio-political discourse in a secular fashion, and claimed that any political structure, any center of political power which is to be justified must be justified by reference to the rights of the individual. And apparently this just somehow happened. And it was a sharp break with political philosophy as it was thought of in the medieval world and so on. That is just not true. It's just not. And I'm going to try and explain why that is. Now, before I do, I realize that if I'm to really give a history of liberalism, even a necessarily brief one as this will be, you have to sort of define what you mean by liberalism. And I'm not really going to embark on a full definition of the entire concept here. I will only confine myself to saying this. A liberal approach to political philosophy is one which is, in some sense, centered around the concept of natural rights, or just rights in general. That it's a rights-based approach to political thinking. I think whatever else you might want to say about liberalism, this is at least a necessary and an essential feature of it. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the pre-modern roots of the idea of the natural rights concept. Now, to really understand this, you have to understand where the modern Western notion of the individual emerged. Now, I remember Keith Woods saying in his video on the Bronze Age mindset that he was aware, he briefly mentioned Simone Weil's essay on the Iliad, and he understood, having read this, that in the classical world, the idea of the individual as we know it today really didn't exist. That is perfectly true. Another book I would recommend, not just to him, but really to anyone watching this, is Fustel de Coulanges' book on the ancient city. And although it's quite an old book, he really does a very deep dive into the mindset of the sort of person who might have lived in the pre-Christian classical world, and really gives you insight into how this person saw the world, how this person understood their place within society, and the just general Weltanschauung, the general worldview that subsisted then. And the main thing that Fustel de Coulanges begins with is, he says that in the deepest antiquity, before even city-states as we know them existed, there were families, that this was the sort of primordial social group. And each family had its own cult of ancestral gods. The father, the head of the household, was not only the patriarch in the sense that he led and controlled the domestic affairs of the family, but he was also the head priest of the familial cult. And so the family essentially revolved around the authority of the paterfamilias. And then later, when different families came together into larger tribes or clans, and then those, by further extension, came together into yet larger groupings that would become the first ancient cities, you essentially had a kind of integration of these groups. But the general structure of the whole group being based around a certain specific cult and its own sort of priestly leaders, that persisted. So Athens had its own gods that were favorable to it, Sparta its own, etc., in that sort of way. It was very much part of the Greek idea that the gods favored certain cities, and so forth. So, because of this, the idea of the individual as we know it did not exist. Every individual person, that is, every human being, was part of some grouping, and in fact was part of a network of groupings. So you were part of your own immediate family, but you were also part of a larger clan, and you were also a citizen of the city-state to which you belonged. You were a citizen of, Sparta, Corinth, Athens, Rome, whatever it was. And so the individual in himself did not have an identity. In fact, he only had an identity insofar as that identity was expressed through his various group memberships. This is, for example, is why Aristotle says that the life of the citizen is the only life worth living, because it is only, according to this view, by integrating yourself within some kind of social order that you acquire an identity. I mean, if you're not a citizen of anywhere, who are you? This is why the origin of the word idiot comes from a Greek word for those who refuse to participate in the political process. They were, in a sense, according to the view that prevailed then, not really fully human because they stood apart and outside of the social order. They had no identities. You can see this also reflected in certain marital traditions. Like, for example, the tradition that we have now that prevails even to this day of a newlywed couple being married and then the husband carrying his wife over the threshold of their new house. This is actually a throwback to that sort of classical conception of marriage, because if a man was to marry a woman, that woman would leave her family, and by separating herself from her previous family would thereby lose her identity. She would temporarily be suspended in a kind of state in which she was no one, and then through the marital ritual would become integrated into her husband's family and then acquire a new identity. So as I said, the individual as we know it did not exist in the classical world. Who you were was entirely a product of your social rank, your group memberships, and so forth. Now, Christianity utterly undid this. Completely and utterly undid this. Now, without getting into too much detail, because it would drag the video out unnecessarily, I think it is much more accurate to say that it was not Thomas Hobbes who first came up with the idea of the individual, but rather it was St. Paul. Because in St. Paul's letters, you see a very simple conception of the then new religion of Christianity being related. No longer is it the case that each individual acquires his identity and acquires his place and position and purpose in life by way of his social rank and his membership in various succeeding social groups through whatever series of steps or layers one might go. What gives one identity, rather, according to the Pauline conception of Christianity, is the relationship that the individual has with God. When you accept Christ, you allow him into your heart, Paul says, you then acquire a direct relationship with divinity itself. And since, as a human being, you are made in the image of God, it is through this relationship that you acquire your identity. Your identity, thus, is not a product of your social rank. It's not a product of who you are within society. It is a product of the way in which you stand with respect to God. And since everyone is a creation of God, and at least in theory, could accept Christianity and could stand in this direct relation to the Creator, in that sense, theoretically, in the eyes of God, Paul concluded, we are all in some sense equal, whatever our differences in natural abilities, social status, and so forth might be. And this became the animating intuition behind Christianity after the fall of Rome. And it is an intuition, a moral intuition, that has been shaping the West ever since. Now, what does this have to do with liberal social contract theory and the idea of natural rights? Well, if we're all equal in the eyes of God, and if the choice to accept Christ is itself an act of will, then there comes to be something important about the human will. And not just the will of the best, the aristocrats, those in power, those of high social standing, but everyone. And so politically, there comes to be this newly placed emphasis on the importance of those in power securing the consent of those over whom they exercise power. A very early example of this is in Charlemagne's reign. Charlemagne was especially fond of gathering his subjects together in various groupings and having them swear all sorts of oaths to him. And again, not just any subjects, not just his most important vassals, but everyone. Serfs, women, absolutely everyone was made to swear these kind of grand oaths of fealty to him on various occasions. Now, of course, I don't deny that many of these oaths were just sort of sworn pro forma and that you didn't really have a kind of meaningful choice there. That may well be, and in fact probably was the case. But it nevertheless is true here that one is at least making gestures that signify that one is at least sort of seeking the consent of the lower orders of society. Something like this would have been unimaginable in the classical world. You do not ask for the consent of your slaves. You do not ask for the consent of your vassals. They are beneath you. They are not important enough for you to even bother trying to secure their consent. In the classical world, if you sought the consent of someone else to empower you to do something in some sort of arrangement, this entailed that you saw the other whose consent you sought to be in some sense equal to you. But your slaves are not your equals. You know, your maidservants are not your equals. It would be a waste of time even trying to secure the consent of such people. And yet, under the sway and under the influence of the Christian moral intuition of the ultimate equality of souls before God, this began to change. Another important way in which you see this happening, and this is what will allow me to segue into the impact of these ideas on social and political and legal thought, is in the Visigothic legal codes. Now the Visigoths, like the other Germanic tribes that took over Europe after the fall of Rome, had legal systems which were very blatantly inegalitarian in the sense that they did not even recognize the concept of equality before the law. What I mean to say here is that the punishment meted out to criminals for various crimes varied with respect to the social rank of the person victimized by the crime. So, if you killed a commoner, your punishment was not as severe as if you killed a minor lord, some lord of some small manor. And then progressively, if you killed or wronged or harmed or robbed or whatever some more powerful lord, some larger more powerful feudal baron, a count, a duke, someone of higher rank, well, then your punishment became progressively more severe. And under the influence of Christian bishops, the Visigoths slowly began to change their law codes, and they began to strip these features away from them, so that the law began morphing in such a way that punishments became standardized and that everything became equalized. That distinctions in social rank, although they obviously did prevail, they did not influence the legal system. So, in other words, it came to be the case that even a commoner could have legitimate claims against a lord. And again, this was all done under the influence of Christian bishops. However, where the process really began to take off, and where we really began to see in embryonic form and then very much so developing further, the notion of individual rights, of natural rights, started in what the legal historian Harold Berman has called the Papal Revolution. And this is really a process from about the 10th to the 12th centuries, in which the Catholic Church attempted to secure its own independence and its own control over its own internal affairs from the meddling of secular rulers. The Church, of course, for a long time had previously attempted to secure its own independence from the state. I mean, after all, Christianity was born in opposition to the Roman Imperium, so there was always bound to be that tension. However, in the immediate centuries preceding the fall of Rome, it came about that secular rulers began exercising more and more control over the internal affairs of the church, nominating bishops and so forth. And the church came to be increasingly solicitous of its own affairs and increasingly desirous of securing its own independence from this kind of meddling. Now, to this end, the church sought to devise its own personal system of law for the government of its own internal affairs. And this law was to be coherent, it was to be consistent, and it needed to have those two qualities so that the church would then have the ability to resolve any sort of internal conflict that happened to arise within its own jurisdiction. So you began to have slews of canon lawyers emerging, formulating and hammering out this system of canon law. And the animating principle, the kind of central ultimate principle behind the idea that the church should govern its own affairs and was an independent jurisdiction unto itself, was the idea of papal sovereignty. So if there was any sort of conflict in the church and in any of its branches, a lowly monk, for example, might have a problem with the rule that his abbot exercises over the monastery. Anything like this. Even in theory, an ordinary lay Christian who sees some abuse going on at the church. Ultimately, the Pope, as the final authority, could be appealed to by anyone within the church hierarchy or any Christian who had any sort of conflict within that the church's general bailiwick. So the Pope became this final authority, and the significance of that was that, well, first of all, the Curia came to be flooded with paperwork, but beyond that sort of obvious bureaucratic consequence, it came about that all intermediate institutions standing between the individual Christian believer and the pontiff were withered away, because in theory it came to be such that the Christian, any Christian, could appeal to the Pope for redress of his issues. And so there was this tendency to make it such that the individual stood alone before the Pope. And the interesting thing about this was that you had these two opposing ideas emerging out of that interplay. On the one hand, of course, there was papal sovereignty. The Pope was, on this conception, the ultimate ruler of all the church, all church affairs. He stood above all church officials. He was at the very apex of the church hierarchy. But not only this, but there were some popes, in particular I'm thinking of Urban III and Urban IV, who took the idea of papal sovereignty so far that they claimed that it extended even over that of secular kings. That a pope could, let's say, excommunicate a king who was not behaving in ways that the pope approved of, or the pope could absolve the subjects of a king of the duty to obey that king. And so the pope became a sovereignty that stood even above the king. So you have this notion of absolutism on the one hand, but also conversely, you have the idea emerging that the individual Christian can, through the medium of canon law, appeal to the Pope for the resolution of his disputes. And so the individual Christian came to acquire importance. And as canon law developed, it was, well, there were sort of three broad sections of canon law, at least with regard to the prescription of conduct, of sort of ethical norms. There was one part that specified that which was obligatory, that is, that which every Christian must do, go to church regularly, believe in God, etc., these things, the obligatory things. There were also the things which were absolutely forbidden, murder, theft, fornication, etc. And then there was a third area, a sort of gray area, in which there was permissible conduct. That is, things which you could do if you chose to do them, but which were not obligatory. So then canon lawyers, what I'm trying to say, is in hammering out canon law, they worked out an area, a space of leeway, a certain area of freedom for individual choice and individual conscience. And because every intermediary institution separating the individual Christian believer from the Pope was worn down in the sense that it was ultimately subservient to the Pope, you naturally began to have emerge this idea that the individual, as someone made in the image of God, as being morally equal, as being a creation of God's, and as standing in his own personal relationship to God, had rights of his own. And the idea of natural rights came to emerge out of this. Now, the conception being developed here was not what we might term the liberal conception, in which there is simply this sovereign, autonomous, rational individual with his own autonomous will who simply chooses between alternatives without reference to any kind of transcendental end. That's not what was going on. This idea of the rights of the individual was at this time very much integrated into the kind of teleological, ethical framework that pervaded medieval thought more generally. But it nevertheless was there. Now, also, a further development was that kings, secular rulers, seeing what popes were doing and seeing the trend toward papal absolutism unfolding, began to pounce on this, and they began to rework their own personal, secular legal systems in such a way that emphasized their own authority. And so you had then emerged the idea of political absolutism. And then conversely, just as you had in the papal case, you also had emerging simultaneously the idea of the rights of the individual with respect to the king. Because remember, in classical society, the individual was integrated into a series of concentric circles of social groupings, starting with the family and then radiating outward into the city-state, or perhaps even further into something like the Roman Empire. But the tendency of Christianity was to erode these things. And so following this, secular rulers would mimic the trend going on within the church and with canon law, and eventually created a situation such that the individual subject of each realm ultimately stood alone before the king in a kind of direct relation to him. And so again, you had these two opposing political ideologies emerging simultaneously out of this dialectic. On the one hand, a kind of regal absolutism, and on the other hand, an emphasis on the rights of the individual. And taken to their logical conclusion, the one side results in absolutism or neo-absolutism, in which power is its own end, and the king, because he is the king, is absolute and may do as he wishes. And then, on the other extreme, something like a kind of natural rights anarchism, in which the state ultimately is not a justifiable institution because it systematically violates the rights of the individual and so forth. So the idea of individual rights was not something that Hobbes just came up with one day. It came out of the Papal Revolution specifically, the Papal Revolution and its impact on Western law, and then also more generally Christianity in general. So, I mean, I think it's interesting to bear this in mind because it really tells you something about how deeply ingrained liberalism is into the Western mindset. It's not something that's just a few centuries old. It's far older than that. Now, there is one further development which I suppose it's important to mention, and that is, well, why is it that during the Middle Ages, as you had this nascent concept of the rights of the individual emerging, why is it that then such a concept as existed was still integrated into a kind of a teleological framework of ends, a sort of scholastic, neo-Aristotelian philosophical and ethical framework, but then later, with Hobbes, with Locke, and with the moderns, the individual will came to be looked at as utterly autonomous and unconstrained by any end, as simply choosing between the various alternatives before it. Well, the reason for this, in a word, is nominalism. I've talked about nominalism in videos I've made in the past, so I won't go into this in much detail, but in brief, in the 14th century, a group of Franciscan theologians, the most prominent of which probably was William of Ockham, were very worried about what they took to be the baleful influence of Aristotle and of Greek philosophy in general on Christian thought. Through the influence of Aristotle, Christianity and its kind of general outlook, and specifically God himself and his own nature, came to be integrated into this system of rational categories, such that it appeared that God himself, in his own will, was being constrained by this rational system. And Occam saw a problem with this. I mean, for example, if, as Thomas Aquinas or any Aristotelian scholastic might have believed, there were such things as universals, well then, it would not then be possible for God to destroy a given universal without also destroying all of the particulars that happen to instantiate that universal. Occam took this as just an unacceptable limitation on God's sovereignty and God's power. So God was being subjected, in his view, to this kind of system of rational categories. And so he began to turn things and say that God's primary attribute is not his reason, but his will. And this slowly, over the course of centuries, began to permeate political thought in the West. The relation to absolutism here is obvious. I mean, it's almost a perfect analogy, because, as I mentioned, the neo-absolutists are complaining that the sovereignty of the state, through liberal social contract theory, is being subjected to some kind of higher rational order, and that this is an unacceptable limitation on its sovereignty. This is exactly the same objection in political terms that Occam had to scholasticism and kind of neo-Aristotelian realism that Occam had in theological terms. So this is just a reprisal of that objection. And that kind of brings up the ultimate joke of what neo-absolutism is. It has this posture of being anti-modern, of being opposed to modernity. And yet it's the most quintessentially modern thing that you can really imagine, because it harkens back to the very theological debates and the very foundational philosophical issues that ultimately generated modernity, which is it's quite funny. I mean, I'm looking back on it, I'm not really sure what to make of neo-absolutism, what to make of post-liberalism, what to make of the whole mess. Is it a tragedy? Is it a farce? Is it both? I don't know. But, but yeah, the idea of the rights of the individual emerged out of the papal revolution and out of the attempts of the church to secure independence from the meddling of secular rulers. The individual came about as a byproduct of this. And so therefore, the conclusion that I'm driving at is that liberalism is a theological doctrine. The reason why liberal moral and political intuitions like the idea of individual property rights appear arbitrary to Keith Woods is that this prior theological baggage has been shorn off of liberalism, and it has, for the last few centuries, been presented as a purely secular doctrine. And I fully agree with him that in those terms it doesn't make sense and it appears arbitrary. But given that liberalism does have these deeper roots, dislodging it from the West is not going to be as simple as just saying, oh, well, Hobbes said some things that were wrong and we need to reject them. And not only is that not going to be a simple matter, it arguably may not even be a desirable matter. The point being that we have to be very careful and try to separate the good within not just modern liberalism, but in its prehistory, and try to disentangle that from the more ridiculous and unconstrained aspects of it that have done so much damage to the West. Now, I won't go into detail here about this, but my view is that liberalism pretty much went wrong starting with John Stuart Mill. It's really only with John Stuart Mill that liberalism morphed into a kind of crusade against normal people. You really didn't see this in the liberals prior to Mill, and you certainly didn't see it in the French liberals. Now, of course, now when people think of liberalism, they think of it as a almost entirely Anglo-centric doctrine, with every single important thinker in the tradition being someone who speaks English. This wasn't the case. If you look at people like Benjamin Constant or Montalembert, Jean-Baptiste Say, Frederick Bastiat even. Let's see, well, Richard Cantillon he was Irish, but he wrote in French, so I guess maybe you could count him there. The point being that these French liberal thinkers were not at all concerned about waging war on society in general. For them, the problem was the state and only the state. This is most obvious in Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, who almost nobody reads now, which is probably because almost none of their work has been translated into English, so you have to know French to be able to read it. But because so many scholars are monolingual and are not able to go back to these texts in other languages, and not just French, and Italian, and even German as well, because they can't read them, and they give this outsized focus to English-speaking writers, in particular Mill. Someone like Mill grew to have a very outsized influence on the history of liberal thought. And as I said, it's really with Mill that the idea begins that liberalism is to be a crusade against normal people. Because it's only with Mill that liberalism starts to concern itself with things like the tyranny of public opinion and custom, and comes to view these things as intolerable encroachments upon the freedom of the individual, and that therefore have to be eroded in the name of freedom. Now, what were Mill's reasons for doing this? Well, in brief, I think it has to do with a woman named Harriet Taylor. Mill fell in love with a married woman, and because of the strict mores of Victorian society, he really couldn't do anything about this and had to just sort of deal with it. Now, imagine by contrast if Mill had been born French. Then it would have just been like, okay, so you're in love with a married woman, big deal. Go have an affair with her. What's the problem? Half the men in France have done that. But of course, Mill lived in in 19th century England and couldn't do any such thing. Now, of course, Harriet Taylor's first husband eventually died, and then even after his death, they still waited another 2 years after that before marrying so that they wouldn't generate any rumors about themselves. And so Mill felt tyrannized by society, really, by kind of the general social mores of his world, and in his alienation felt compelled to wage war on it, and so he began to turn liberalism into something which placed itself in opposition to the prevailing mood. And as I said, this was not true of the French thinkers that came before him. I'll offer Benjamin Constant as an example, who wrote an enormous amount about religion and who is perfectly clear that a liberal society could only exist with a Christian moral foundation. That were this to be eroded, liberal norms would shortly thereafter also be eroded. But anyway, I just want to conclude this by saying that it is interesting to look at sort of the prehistory of the concept of the individual and the natural rights concept. It wasn't just something that, Hobbes made up. And therefore it has far deeper roots in Western history than one would think if one were to just frame things in such a way that, Hobbes started it. And so, if we are to overcome the problems of modernity, then we have to do something that Keith Woods actually also briefly mentioned in his video about Bronze Age pervert. That is, that you have to take the ideas of the past and integrate them into whatever it is that shall form the makeup of culture going forward. So, in a sense, we're going to have to make our peace with liberalism in that we're at least going to have to accept the general liberal notion that, yes, power is to be subject to a rational order standing above it, and it is not self-justifying, that there is some tribunal higher than it before which it must justify itself. And so the the neo-absolutist or the post-liberal prescription, insofar as it just says that power is a dead end. And that's really all I've got to say about that. So thank you for listening.